Y'all can head back to your seats now. Thank you, Benjamin. So a few weeks ago, I shared these words by Willie James Jennings. I've been told that we've quoted Willie James Jennings a lot during this sermon series. So there's even been talk about making bingo cards about the amount of times we mention certain folks. And so I support that. Whatever helps you stay engaged, you know. I quote him because his commentary, this book he's written on Acts, has just blown my mind. And so it's really opened me up to see Acts with fresh eyes. And so we shared these words a few weeks ago where he said, just as we never leave the presence of the Spirit in Luke's narrative, we never leave sight of the prison. He says we never leave sight of the prison. Did you know that the followers of Jesus are arrested no less than 11 times in the book of Acts? 11 different times. Followers of Jesus end up in prison 11 different times. And that's only the arrest that Luke decided to tell us about. There were certainly more. I have to tell you, I'm a follower of Jesus and I've never been arrested. John Lewis, on the other hand, was a follower of Jesus. He was arrested more than 40 different times during his life. Martin Luther King Jr., who many of y'all know was a follower of Jesus, he was arrested 29 times during his life. You know, often in the book of Acts, when the Spirit moves in a powerful way, trouble often follows. When people respond positively to the gospel, there are often powerful people who respond very negatively and often aggressively and even violently to the move of the Spirit. And the early Christians suffered greatly because of it. You know, last week we talked about Lydia and her radical hospitality, the risky thing she did when she offered her home to Paul and Silas and his friends. In chapter 16, another thing happens, is that Paul and Silas, after Lydia invites them into their home, they go out into the community and they end up getting arrested. They're tortured. They're thrown into maximum security. It says the innermost cell is where they were put. This is the 8th arrest in the book of Acts in chapter 16. So why did Paul and Silas get thrown into prison? Well, what they did was they healed a young woman who was enslaved. Now, that doesn't sound like something that should get you thrown into prison, but this is what happened. Luke tells us that this girl had some kind of spirit he describes as kind of an evil spirit that gave her the gift of fortune telling. She was a slave, and so her owners saw that she had this unique gift. And so what did they do? They exploited her for profit. So they would likely take her around and have her tell the fortunes of folks who would pay money and compensate them for this talent that she had. Paul ends up meeting her and eventually ends up removing the spirit from her, which meant she no longer had the gift of fortune telling. Her owners were enraged at this exorcism of this spirit. Now, why were these folks so enraged that she was set free of this thing that was keeping her in a place that wasn't so good? Well, here's what it says. When her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They brought them before the magistrates and said, "These men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for Romans to accept or practice." Now, I don't know if you noticed what happened there. It says, Luke tells us that they were upset because they lost their ability to exploit her and to make money. And so they went and got the authorities involved. Often the owners, often folks like these folks, they're right in line. The authorities are there to help them kind of pursue their interest in what they want. So they get the authorities involved, and the authorities come to their aid. But then instead of talking about losing their ability to make money, they stir up this anti-Jewish sentiment. And they say, oh, these are Jewish folks who are coming and talking about things that are not good and living this life that's different. They stir up hatred for Paul and Silas because they were Jews. This is a similar pattern we've seen over and over and over throughout history. Powerful people feel threatened in some way by foreigners, and so they use racism, bigotry, and xenophobia to stir up hatred and violence against them. And this is what they did to Paul and Silas. Their power was threatened, their money was threatened, and so they labeled Paul and Silas as those dangerous foreigners, those Jews, and they stirred up hatred and violence against them. You know, we're in another election year, and we see this pattern happening once again. It happened 4 years ago, it'll happen 4 years before that, and it's happened all throughout in between. All of a sudden now, everyone feels like they have to talk about the dangers of immigration, stirring up fears and lies about immigrants in order to hold on to their money and power. It worked 2,000 years ago in Acts, and it's working today. And as followers of Jesus, we've got to resist that kind of stuff and push against that kind of stuff. Paul and Silas were released from prison, and they moved on to another city called Thessalonica. When they arrived in Thessalonica, they found a man named Jason who let them stay in his home. Once again, we see a follower of Jesus who opened up his home for Paul and Silas to stay with them. We're going to find out this was actually a very radical and dangerous thing for Jason to do. Jason's home became a home base for their time in Thessalonica. For 3 Sabbaths, so for 3 weeks, they went to the synagogues and they heard the scriptures, they worshiped, and they discussed Jesus with their fellow Jews. It seems like their practice was often they would hear a word and then they would have time for discussion about it. And so Paul and Silas went, heard the scriptures, and talked about it and brought Jesus into the conversation to try to tell folks about what they believed about Jesus. Luke tells us that many Jews and Greeks ended up giving their life to Jesus because of those conversations with Paul and Silas. However, Luke tells us that there were others who were not so happy. There were other Jews in the city who were furious that Paul and Silas had come to their city, stirring up controversy and bringing unnecessary drama into their community. These, you could probably say, were the guardians of the status quo, and Paul and Silas were disrupting the status quo, and people who kind of don't want things to change, they don't like that. So they did not like Paul and Silas coming and talking about these new ideas. They heard that Paul and Silas were staying at Jason's house. I imagine rumors went around, do you know where these guys are staying? We got to deal with these people. Oh, I think Jason maybe had taken them in. So they end up forming a mob. They formed a mob, and they all went to Jason's house to find Paul and Silas. Once again, this is a terrifying situation. I've never had a mob of people coming towards my house. I don't like to see mobs of people. That's a very terrifying thing, right? Imagine how scary this must have been. Rumors are probably, people were running ahead to Jason and be like, dude, people are coming. Like, you need to get ready for this. This was a violent mob heading to this man's home. They end up getting to his house. They break into his home. They couldn't find Paul and Silas, and so they grabbed Jason and whoever else was there and took them by force to the city officials. A terrifying situation. Jason providing hospitality meant that he ended up getting taken into the authorities by this mob. And here's what they said about them. They went to the authorities. They said, these people who have been turning the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has entertained them as guests. They are all acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying that there is another king named Jesus. So they arrested Jason and the others for harboring these perceived threats to the government, to their existence, Paul and Silas. This is the 9th arrest in the book of Acts. 2 things were said about Paul and Silas and the rest of these Christians. First off, I love this, they were turning the world upside down. That's what they thought. They literally thought that they were turning which kind of they were, right? Because that's what the gospel does. And when you turn the world upside down, often the ones who are at the top don't like that too much, right? They were going against the grain. They were refusing to just get in line. The second thing they said about them was that they were acting against the law. They were breaking the law, they said, by giving their allegiance to another king named Jesus. This reminds me of a guy that I mentioned to you all a few weeks ago, Shane Claiborne. And I actually went to Michigan. Family here at our church, Will and Jamie Shire, invited Laura and I and Kai to go up to Michigan. And we ended up getting to meet Shane and spend some time with him up there because he was teaching at this place in northern Michigan. But Shane, I met him many years ago when I was in college, and he really impacted my life. Just his witness and his example of really trying to follow Jesus. He calls himself a red letter Christian. You know how a lot of Bibles, Jesus' words all in red letters, because he says, I follow Jesus and his teachings. And I like to think that I try to be a red letter Christian as well. But I shared a few weeks ago a story about a situation that happened in Philadelphia over 20 years ago. And it's interesting because we're seeing the same cycle emerge now, even today. The city government passed some anti-homelessness laws that prohibited serving food and sleeping in public parks. And we're seeing the same exact thing happening now. They were doing it in Philly over 20 years ago. And so Shane and his friends were so disturbed that they decided to have a big event in one of the city's parks called Love Park is the name of the city. And so it's a perfect place to go serve food and hang out with folks who are struggling. And so they said, well, we're not just going to serve food, we're going to share communion. Because, that's not controversial, right? We're going to go serve communion in Love Park. And they ended up doing it one night, and the whole park was surrounded by police officers. And they came in and arrested all of them for violating their laws that said you couldn't serve food in these parks. When in court, they argued their case, and I'll tell you, one of their arguments he shared was this, that it actually violates their religious freedom to say they can't serve food in Love Park because our faith teaches us that we must serve people who are hungry, right? And they did a good job because they ended up getting all the charges thrown out. But here's what the judge said. He said, if it weren't for people who broke the bad laws, we wouldn't have the freedom we have. We'd still have slavery. That's the story of this country from the Boston Tea Party to the Civil Rights Movement. He said, these folks are not criminals, they are freedom fighters. Now that's a good judge, I gotta say. This judge referred to the Civil Rights Movement, which was led by a lot of folks. Kind of their figurehead, as we know, was Dr. King, right? You got to understand something about Dr. King's life. I didn't realize this until a few years back, but I always thought Dr. King, throughout his whole life, was loved by everyone. But that's not the reality, right? He was a despised enemy of the state, and people thought he was an enemy of this country. Most people did. At the time of his death, they did surveys around this. 72% of white Americans disapproved of Dr. King. 55% of black Americans disapproved of Martin Luther King. He was isolated. He was alienated. During his life, he made decisions that got him into a lot of trouble. Like the early Christians, I bet when he rolled into town, just like them, people were saying, oh no, here comes this man who's turning the world upside down. And he's breaking all of our laws and our norms and our customs. We got to get him out of there. And many of them did this, that. Mobs formed. They took him before the city officials. And oftentimes the police worked with the folks who were racist, and they would put them in jail and all these different things. Most people didn't want him around. He was arrested many times. During one of his arrests, he penned one of the most powerful writings in American history. It's called The Letter from Birmingham Jail. And this one's in particularly important for Christians because he writes it to Christians. He's writing it to Christian leaders, to these pastors, because he was so upset and disturbed by the fact that they would not support what they were doing in the freedom movement. So he wrote it to these white pastors, basically saying, y'all need to step up. This is part of our faith tradition, is to support this kind of movement. Y'all may be concerned that we're breaking the laws and doing these things, but an unjust law is no law at all. He says these kinds of things, pushing them. And he reminds them of people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and how they stood up and defied the law and got into trouble. And so he's trying to challenge these Christians to stop playing the middle of the road. And in his letter, one of the things that convicts me is he says he's not so worried about the racist folks. He's really worried about the moderate people who just won't do anything. He's like, y'all need to get on board and stop just playing middle of the road. Because we need you to join up with our fight and our movement towards freedom together. In the letter, he distinguishes between two types of peace. One type of peace that we often think about is the absence of tension. And that's kind of like when we say, I just need some peace and quiet, right? I feel like that sometimes in my house, just with a toddler. It's like, I just need peace and quiet, I need the tension to go away, right? And that's the kind of peace that we need in our lives sometimes. But when we're talking about peace for a whole community or for society, we're talking about much bigger than that. And he says the other type of peace is what we would call the presence of justice. The biblical concept of peace comes from a Hebrew word, shalom. Shalom is not about the absence of tension. It's about this type of peace where everybody has enough, where all are taken care of. It's a kind of peace where if one person has peace but another doesn't, it's not true peace, right? It's for everybody. And in order to achieve justice, he argues, sometimes there will be tension because we've got to push back against these things that are no good and are hurting others. The history of the Jesus movement contains lots of tension. Lots of acts of defiance, lots of civil disobedience, people refusing to obey the law of the land when the law of the land was unjust. Even at Christ's birth, from the very beginning of Jesus' story, what did the Magi do? Remember the story of the Magi? They go to the king and he's like, well, you go investigate and you come back and tell me about this new king. They didn't go back to Herod and do what Herod told them to do, right? They didn't do it. They decided, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to defy what we were told by the king and do something else, defying the law so they could protect Jesus. Shane argues that civil disobedience, this idea of going against the law when the law is not just, is better described as divine obedience. He says we obey God even when the laws of the land or the norms of our culture or the unspoken rules stand in the way. And sometimes our obedience for God might lead us to disobey the things that are not good and are hurting others. Our society, when people are willing to stand up and go against the grain, when people are willing to say, hey, I'm not going to go by this because this is hurting people and this is not what my faith teaches me. When people are willing to do that, we often demonize them. We certainly try to silence them. People who are willing to stand up against these unjust laws, cultural norms that are not just. But it's always confusing to me why Christians get so upset about this, because from the beginnings of our faith, we have a rich tradition of this, of what we could call holy defiant ones, people who are willing to break rank and follow God regardless of the cost. And knowing about this tradition leaves me confused when Christians seek to silence and marginalize people who are willing to stand up and be different. Knowing about the mother of Moses, we don't hear a lot about her, but the mother of Moses broke the Egyptian laws to save her son. Knowing about Moses, who defied Pharaoh, the leader of the land, and defied the entire Egyptian empire. Knowing about Rahab, who took a dangerous risk by harboring Israelite visitors. Knowing about Ruth, who defied Moabite cultural norms and left her people to care for an enemy, an Israelite. Knowing about the prophets, all of the prophets who were despised and hated and locked up for doing things that kings did not like. Knowing about Daniel, who refused the king's food and prayed to the God of Israel when he was told he couldn't. Knowing about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to obey the laws of the land, forcing them to bow down and worship that golden statue. Knowing about Esther, who risked her life to stand up for her people. Knowing about the Magi who lied to Herod in order to protect baby Jesus. Knowing about John the Baptist who was beheaded because he was perceived as a threat by the authorities. Knowing about Jesus who defied cultural norms, spoke powerful truth, and faced the ultimate punishment of death. Knowing about Stephen, the first Christian martyr who was stoned and thrown off a cliff for preaching the gospel when it wasn't allowed. Knowing about Jason, who showed hospitality to the early Christians who were turning the world upside down. Knowing about John and Paul, who penned large portions of the New Testament while incarcerated in detention centers. Knowing about Peter, who was executed upside down on a cross. Knowing about this rich history of godly people who oppose the empire leaves me baffled when we try to silence the Christians who speak up and defy the unjust laws and the cultural norms of our land. Nonviolent protest against laws and cultural norms that hurt people is a very godly practice. And it is something that it's embedded in our tradition. There are moments in our lives and moments in history, I think, when we have to be willing to stand up and be different, to go against the grain, to do something that could potentially cost us everything. I love these words in Esther. Esther was asked to do something very, very challenging and risky. But here's what was said to her. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Who knows? Perhaps God has raised you up for such a time as this. This is a difficult time, yes, a challenging time. But I know it's an opportunity for all of us to ask God and ask the Spirit how we might stand up and be different and truly follow in the path of Jesus. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.